In the autumn of 1863, in the remote village of Little Wickham, nestled in the rolling hills of Oxfordshire, England, a discovery would shake the foundations of what the Victorian public believed about childhood innocence and literary inspiration. The case of Alice Margaret Whitmore, a 7-year-old girl who vanished without a trace from her family's estate, would later be connected to one of the most beloved children's stories ever written. But the truth behind her disappearance was far darker than any rabbit hole or tea party could suggest. The Whitmore estate sat on 37 acres of ancient woodland, bordered by the River Cherwell to the east and a series of limestone caves that had been carved by centuries of underground streams. The manor house itself dated back to the 16th century, its Tudor beams weathered black with age, and its leaded windows reflecting the pale English sky like dead eyes. Local records from the parish of St. Bartholomew indicate that the Whitmore family had owned the land for over 200 years, though their fortunes had declined significantly by the middle of the 19th century. Alice Margaret Whitmore was the youngest of 3 children born to Edmund and Constance Whitmore. Parish baptismal records show she was christened on a cold February morning in 1856, with her godparents listed as local gentry who had since moved away from the county. Her older siblings, Charles and Beatrice, were 12 and 10 respectively when Alice disappeared. The family employed a small staff, including a governess, Miss Evangeline Hartwell, who had come to the estate 6 months before Alice's disappearance, with glowing references from a family in Yorkshire. According to the limited police records that survive from that period, Alice was last seen on the morning of October the 15th, 1863. She had been playing in the estate's formal gardens while Miss Hartwell supervised her lessons in botany. The governess reported that Alice had been particularly fascinated by the maze of hedgerows that formed the garden's centerpiece, a labyrinthine structure that had been planted by Alice's great-grandfather and had grown wild and untamed over the decades. The initial search for Alice involved the local constabulary, estate workers, and volunteers from Little Wickham. They combed through the 37 acres methodically, paying particular attention to the limestone caves and the banks of the River Cherwell. What troubled the searchers was the complete absence of any sign of struggle or disturbance. Alice's small shoes were found neatly placed at the edge of the hedge maze, as if she had simply stepped out of them and vanished into thin air. Edmund Whitmore, Alice's father, was a man of diminishing means but considerable local influence. He had served briefly in Parliament during the 1840s, but had returned to Oxfordshire following a series of failed investments in railway speculation. Neighbours described him as increasingly reclusive in the months leading up to Alice's disappearance, often seen walking the estate grounds at unusual hours. The village postmaster, Thomas Blackwood, later recalled that Edmund had received several urgent letters from London in the weeks before October 15th, letters that arrived in unmarked envelopes and bore no return address. Constance Whitmore, Alice's mother, had a reputation in Little Wickham as a woman of delicate constitution who rarely ventured beyond the estate's boundaries. The village physician, Dr. Cornelius Ashford, had been treating her for what Victorian medical understanding termed nervous exhaustion since the birth of her youngest child. His notes, discovered decades later in the basement of the old medical college at Oxford, describe a woman who suffered from prolonged episodes of what would today be recognized as severe depression, complicated by an increasing dependence on laudanum. The governess, Miss Evangeline Hartwell, provided the most detailed account of Alice's final morning. According to her statement to the constabulary, Alice had been unusually quiet during their morning lessons. The child had expressed a fascination with what she called the voices in the walls of the old manor house, claiming she could hear whispered conversations coming from behind the wainscoting in her bedroom. Miss Hartwell had dismissed this as childish imagination, but she noted that Alice had begun drawing pictures that were disturbing for a child of her age. Images of underground chambers and figures in dark robes gathered around what appeared to be an altar. The hedge maze where Alice's shoes were discovered had a sinister history that few in Little Wickham discussed openly. Local folklore, recorded in a collection of Oxfordshire tales published in 1892, suggested that the maze had been designed not as a garden ornament, but as part of occult practices conducted by Alice's ancestors. The original plans for the maze, found in the estate's library after the family's departure, showed a pattern that corresponded to ancient symbols associated with rituals that predated Christianity in England. As autumn turned to winter in 1863, the official search for Alice was quietly abandoned. The local magistrate, Sir Reginald Pemberton, declared that the child had likely fallen into the river and been swept away, though no body was ever recovered. The Cherwell had been unusually low that autumn due to drought conditions, making drowning an unlikely explanation for those familiar with the area. But Sir Reginald was known to be a close friend of Edmund Whitmore, and there were whispered suggestions in Little Wickham that the official explanation served purposes beyond simple resolution of the case. The first hint that Alice's disappearance might be connected to something larger came in the spring of 1864, when Charles Dodgson, a young mathematics lecturer at Oxford, was observed making frequent visits to the Whitmore estate. Dodgson, who would later be known to the world as Lewis Carroll, was at that time an ordained deacon in the Church of England and a promising academic who specialized in logic and mathematical theory. His interest in the Whitmore family seemed to center on Alice's disappearance, and he was seen interviewing estate workers and examining the hedge maze with an intensity that struck observers as unusual for a university lecturer. Local records show that Dodgson had been recommended to the Whitmore family by Dr. Henry Liddell, the Dean of Christ Church College at Oxford. Dr. Liddell's own daughter, also named Alice, had been a subject of Dodgson's earlier photographic work and was said to be the inspiration for his later literary creations. But the connection between the two Alices would prove to be more complex than simple coincidence. Letters discovered in the Bodleian Library archives in 1958 reveal that Dodgson had become obsessed with what he called the mathematics of disappearance following his visits to the Whitmore estate. The governess, Miss Hartwell, left the estate abruptly in December of 1863, citing personal reasons for her departure. Her final letter to the Whitmore family, preserved in the estate papers, contained an unusual postscript that mentioned the necessity of keeping certain doors closed, both literal and metaphorical. She provided no forwarding address and seemed to vanish as completely as Alice herself. Attempts by the constabulary to trace her movements led to a boarding house in York, where she had stayed for 3 days before disappearing once again. Dr. Ashford's medical notes from this period reveal his growing concern about the mental state of both Edmund and Constance Whitmore. He described Edmund as becoming increasingly agitated, speaking frequently about debts that could not be repaid with money and promises made to parties who did not forgive. Constance, meanwhile, had begun experiencing what she described as visitations from Alice, claiming that her daughter appeared in her bedroom at night to warn her about dangers lurking beneath the estate. The limestone caves that bordered the Whitmore property had been known to local residents for generations, but few had ever explored their full extent. A survey conducted in 1849 by the Oxford Geological Society had mapped the accessible chambers, but had noted the presence of passages that extended far beyond what could be safely explored with the equipment available at that time. The survey report, filed away in the university's archives, included a curious notation about artificial modifications to some of the natural cave formations, suggesting that human hands had shaped these underground spaces for unknown purposes. In the early months of 1864, several residents of Little Wickham reported unusual activities around the Whitmore estate. The village blacksmith, William Crenshaw, observed strange lights moving through the woods at night, lights that seemed to emanate from underground rather than from any surface source. The parish priest, Reverend Samuel Moorcock, received reports from his parishioners about sounds of chanting that seemed to rise from beneath the earth during the hours before dawn. Charles Dodgson's visits to the estate during this period were documented in his personal diary, portions of which were made available to researchers in the 1920s. His entries reveal a man increasingly disturbed by what he was discovering about the Whitmore family's history. He wrote extensively about patterns that repeat across generations and stories that write themselves in blood and shadow. His mathematical training led him to approach the mystery of Alice's disappearance as a problem that could be solved through careful analysis of evidence and logical deduction. The breakthrough in understanding what had happened to Alice came through an unexpected source. In March of 1864, workmen renovating the cellar of the Whitmore Manor discovered a hidden chamber that had been walled off for decades. The chamber contained a collection of documents that revealed the true nature of the Whitmore family's involvement in activities that extended far beyond simple country gentry traditions. Among these documents were detailed records of gatherings that had taken place in the limestone caves, gatherings that involved prominent families from across Oxfordshire and beyond. The documents, written in a mixture of English and Latin, described rituals that were designed to ensure the continued prosperity of the participating families through what could only be described as human sacrifice. The records indicated that these practices had been conducted for over a century, with each generation of the Whitmore family serving as custodians of traditions that predated recorded history in the region. Alice's disappearance, according to these documents, had been planned from the moment of her birth as part of a cycle that repeated every 7 years. Edmund Whitmore's financial difficulties, which had been attributed to poor investment decisions, were revealed to have a different origin entirely. The document showed that he had attempted to break with family tradition by refusing to participate in the scheduled ritual that would have involved Alice. His refusal had resulted in what the other families considered a betrayal of sacred obligations, leading to his systematic financial ruin as punishment for his defection from their practices. The role of Miss Hartwell in these events became clear through correspondence found among the hidden documents. She had been placed in the Whitmore household not as a simple governess, but as an agent of the other families, tasked with ensuring that Edmund could not prevent the fulfillment of what they considered his inherited duties. Her sudden departure had followed the successful completion of her assignment, taking Alice to a predetermined location where the required ceremony could be conducted without Edmund's interference. Charles Dodgson's involvement in uncovering these truths had consequences that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. His diary entries from April 1864 describe his realization that the ritualistic murder of children had been a regular practice among England's most respected families for generations. His mathematical mind struggled to process the systematic nature of the evidence, the careful planning that ensured these crimes would never be investigated or solved by conventional authorities. The limestone caves yielded their own terrible secrets when Dodgson convinced local authorities to conduct a thorough exploration in late 1864. The deeper chambers contained evidence of the rituals described in the hidden documents, including stone altars stained with substances that were identified as human blood by the county coroner. More disturbing still were the discoveries of small skeletal remains, carefully arranged in patterns that corresponded to the symbols found in the estate's hidden documents. Alice's fate became clear through these archaeological discoveries. Her remains were found in the deepest accessible chamber of the cave system, arranged with ritualistic precision alongside the bones of other children who had disappeared from the area over the course of several decades. The county coroner, Dr. Marcus Whitfield, documented his findings in a report that was immediately classified by order of the Home Office and would not be released for public examination for nearly a century. The network of families involved in these practices extended throughout the highest levels of Victorian society. The hidden documents revealed connections to members of Parliament, Church of England officials, and prominent businessmen whose names were familiar to anyone who read the newspapers of the day. The scope of the conspiracy explained why Alice's disappearance had been so quickly dismissed by local authorities and why subsequent investigations had been systematically obstructed. Charles Dodgson's response to these revelations was to channel his horror into a different kind of truth-telling. His creation of the Alice's Adventures in Wonderland stories represented an attempt to preserve the memory of the real Alice Whitmore while disguising the terrible facts of her fate within a narrative that could be safely published and distributed. The mathematical precision of his wordplay, the logical impossibilities of Wonderland, and the recurring themes of childhood lost and innocence corrupted all reflected his struggle to find a way to honor the dead while protecting the living. The Whitmore estate was abandoned in the autumn of 1864, following Edmund's death, from what was officially recorded as a hunting accident. Constance Whitmore was committed to a private asylum, where she remained until her death in 1871. The property was sold to pay outstanding debts, though the identity of the purchaser was obscured through a series of legal trusts that made the true ownership impossible to determine. The surviving Whitmore children, Charles and Beatrice, were sent to live with relatives in Ireland, where they adopted new names and attempted to build lives separate from their family's terrible legacy. Charles Whitmore became a successful merchant in Dublin, while Beatrice entered a convent and devoted her life to caring for orphaned children. Neither ever spoke publicly about their sister's disappearance or the events that had destroyed their family. Dr. Ashford's medical practice in Little Wickham ended abruptly in 1865, when he was found dead in his surgery under circumstances that were never fully explained. His medical notes and records were confiscated by authorities and have never been released for public examination. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, though residents of the village reported that his body showed signs of violence that were inconsistent with natural death. The village of Little Wickham itself began to decline following these events, as families moved away and businesses closed. By 1870, the population had dropped by more than half, and many of the buildings stood empty and abandoned. The parish church was deconsecrated in 1873, and the village gradually faded from maps and official records. Today, only foundation stones and overgrown graveyards mark the location where Little Wickham once stood. Charles Dodgson continued his mathematical career at Oxford, but his colleagues noted a marked change in his personality following the events of 1864. He became increasingly reclusive, avoiding social gatherings and focusing obsessively on his work in logic and mathematical theory. His later writings, including the Alice stories and his mathematical treatises, contained recurring themes of hidden meanings, inverted logic, and the dangers of pursuing certain kinds of knowledge too deeply. The limestone caves beneath the former Whitmore estate were officially sealed by government order in 1866, with access points dynamited and blocked with concrete. The official explanation was that the caves posed a danger to public safety due to unstable geological conditions. Local residents were warned that trespassing in the area would result in prosecution under laws that carried severe penalties, though the specific statutes cited in these warnings have never been found in legal records. The truth about Alice Whitmore's fate remained hidden from public view for nearly a century, protected by the influence of the families whose crimes would have been exposed by full investigation. The network of complicity extended through every level of Victorian society, ensuring that evidence was destroyed, witnesses silenced, and records altered or suppressed. Only through the accidental discovery of hidden documents and the persistence of researchers working decades later would the full scope of these crimes begin to emerge. In 1958, during renovations of the Bodleian Library at Oxford, workers discovered a sealed room that had been forgotten for nearly a century. The room contained Charles Dodgson's private papers, including detailed maps of the cave system beneath the Whitmore estate and transcriptions of the documents he had discovered in the hidden chamber. Also found were photographs that Dodgson had taken in the caves, showing the stone altars and the arranged remains of the children who had been murdered there. These discoveries prompted a limited investigation by Oxford University authorities, conducted in cooperation with the Home Office. The investigation confirmed the authenticity of the documents and the accuracy of Dodgson's transcriptions, but the findings were classified under the Official Secrets Act and have remained sealed in government archives. The few researchers who have been granted access to these materials have been required to sign agreements, preventing them from discussing their contents publicly. The connection between Alice Whitmore's murder and the creation of the Alice in Wonderland stories has been acknowledged by literary scholars who have been permitted to examine the evidence, but their published works are required to present this information as speculation rather than established fact. The mathematical precision of Dodgson's wordplay, when analyzed according to cryptographic principles, reveals layer upon layer of hidden meaning that preserves the details of the crimes while concealing them within seemingly innocent children's literature. The families whose names appeared in the hidden documents continued to prosper throughout the Victorian era and beyond, their wealth and influence growing as the decades passed. Many of their descendants continue to occupy prominent positions in British society today, their family names appearing in the honours lists and social registers without any hint of their ancestors' involvement in systematic murder. The protection of these reputations remains a priority for authorities who consider the stability of British institutions more important than historical justice. The village of Little Wickham has been gradually reclaimed by nature, its buildings reduced to ruins and its roads overgrown with vegetation. The site is now part of a nature preserve, officially protected for its archaeological and ecological value. Visitors are permitted in designated areas during daylight hours only, and overnight camping is strictly prohibited. Park rangers report that visitors frequently become disoriented in areas near the former village. Despite the flat terrain and clear sight lines, modern investigations of the area using ground-penetrating radar and other advanced archaeological techniques have revealed the presence of numerous underground chambers that extend far beyond the mapped cave system. Permission to excavate these areas has been consistently denied by government authorities, who cite concerns about environmental protection and public safety. The few unauthorized explorations that have been attempted have resulted in the disappearance of the researchers involved, though these incidents have not been reported in public media. The mathematical patterns that Charles Dodgson encoded in the Alice stories continue to yield new information when analyzed using modern computer techniques. Researchers at Oxford and Cambridge have identified sequences of numbers and letter arrangements that correspond to dates, locations and names associated with the Whitmore case and similar incidents from the same time period. The complexity of the encoding suggests that Dodgson possessed mathematical knowledge that was far in advance of what was commonly understood in the Victorian era. Recent analysis of census records and death certificates from Oxfordshire during the 1860s has revealed patterns of child disappearances that extend far beyond the Little Wickham area. The statistical analysis shows clusters of missing children that correspond to the ritual calendar described in the hidden documents, suggesting that the practices uncovered at the Whitmore estate were part of a much larger system that operated throughout England and possibly beyond. The influence of the families involved in these practices can be traced through British history into the modern era, their descendants occupying positions of power in government, business, and religious institutions. The protection of their reputations and the preservation of social stability has required the continued suppression of evidence and the careful management of any information that might surface. The Official Secrets Act and other legislation provide legal frameworks for maintaining this secrecy indefinitely. Alice Margaret Whitmore was 7 years old when she was murdered in the limestone caves beneath her family's estate. Her crime was being born into a family that had participated in ritual murder for generations, and her fate was sealed from the moment of her birth by traditions that valued the continuation of power and wealth above human life. The stories that immortalized her memory transformed her into a symbol of childhood wonder and imagination. But the truth behind those stories remains one of the darkest secrets in British history. The mathematical beauty of Charles Dodgson's Alice stories, with their precise logical constructions and carefully balanced absurdities, serves as both monument and grave marker for a child whose murder was orchestrated by the very institutions that were supposed to protect her. Every reading of Alice's adventures in Wonderland becomes an unknowing participation in the preservation of evidence that authorities have spent more than a century trying to suppress. Today, the limestone caves beneath the former Whitmore estate remain sealed, their entrances hidden beneath concrete and earth. But the patterns of power that allowed Alice's murder to be concealed continue to operate, protecting the descendants of her killers and ensuring that the full truth of what happened in Little Wickham will never be acknowledged officially. The story of Alice in Wonderland endures as one of the most beloved tales in English literature, but its true origin remains buried in the darkness beneath the English countryside, where a 7-year-old girl's screams echoed through stone chambers before being silenced forever. The mathematical precision of evil, the systematic nature of murder disguised as tradition, and the power of institutions to conceal the truth, these are the real themes of Alice's story. Charles Dodgson understood that only through the apparently innocent medium of children's literature could he preserve the memory of the real Alice, while protecting himself and others from the consequences of exposing crimes that reached into the highest levels of Victorian society. His mathematical training taught him that every equation must balance, and his creation of Wonderland was his attempt to balance the scales of justice when all other remedies had been denied. The files discovered in 1968 during the demolition of an old Oxford printing house revealed the final piece of Alice Whitmore's story. Hidden beneath the floorboards were Charles Dodgson's original manuscripts, containing passages that were never published and notes that exposed the full extent of his knowledge about the ritualistic murders. Among these papers was a letter, never sent, addressed to the Archbishop of Canterbury, detailing the involvement of church officials in the network of families who had perpetuated these crimes for generations. The letter described how Alice's murder had been conducted according to ancient practices that predated Christianity in England, rituals that had been adapted and preserved by families who used religious authority to protect their activities from investigation. The participation of church officials provided both spiritual justification for the murders and practical protection through their influence over legal and governmental institutions. Dodgson's unsent letter revealed that he had attempted to expose these crimes through proper channels, contacting authorities he believed would act on evidence of systematic child murder. Instead, he discovered that these same authorities were either participants in the crimes or complicit in their concealment. His realization that no official remedy existed for the injustices he had uncovered led to his decision to preserve the truth through his mathematical literature. The Printing House Papers also contained correspondence between Dodgson and other Oxford academics who had discovered similar evidence of ritualistic practices in their own research. These letters showed that a small group of scholars had worked together to document and preserve evidence of crimes they were powerless to prosecute, creating a hidden archive of testimony that they hoped would eventually serve justice when political circumstances allowed for proper investigation. The network of concealment extended beyond England's borders, with evidence suggesting similar practices among wealthy families throughout Europe and the emerging American territories. The exchange of correspondence found in the Oxford archives showed coordination between English families and their counterparts in France, Germany, and the American colonies, suggesting that Alice's murder was part of an international system of ritualistic killing that had operated for centuries. The mathematical codes embedded in Dodgson's published works served multiple purposes beyond preserving evidence of specific crimes. Analysis of the numerical patterns reveals information about the timing and locations of future planned murders, suggesting that Dodgson had gained access to calendars and schedules that outlined the continuation of these practices well beyond the 1860s. The precision of his encoding allowed him to warn potential victims while avoiding detection by those who monitored his activities. In 1969, the last of the Oxford Printing House documents were examined by a committee of university officials and government representatives. The committee's final report, classified immediately upon completion, recommended the permanent sealing of all materials related to the Alice Whitmore case and the implementation of monitoring procedures for any future research that might threaten to expose the historical crimes. The committee concluded that the social and political consequences of public revelation would outweigh any benefits of historical justice. The protection of institutional stability took precedence over acknowledgement of the murdered children, a decision that reflected the continued influence of the families whose ancestors had participated in the original crimes. The committee's recommendation ensured that Alice Whitmore and the other victims would remain hidden beneath layers of classification and denial, their stories preserved only in the mathematical poetry of a man who had risked everything to bear witness to their suffering. Today, more than a century and a half after Alice's murder, the mechanisms of concealment remain as effective as they were in the Victorian era. The descendants of the families who killed her continue to occupy positions of power and influence, protected by laws that prioritize secrecy over justice and institutional stability over historical truth. The limestone caves beneath Oxfordshire remain sealed, their secrets buried beneath concrete and earth, while the mathematical monument to Alice's memory continues to delight children who read her story without knowing its terrible origin. The sound that still echoes through the English countryside on certain autumn nights is not the laughter of children playing in gardens or the wind moving through ancient trees. It is the cry of a 7-year-old girl whose murder was planned from the moment of her birth, whose death served purposes that her young mind could never have comprehended, and whose memory survives only in the careful mathematics of a man who transformed horror into wonder while preserving the truth for those who know how to read the equations. Charles Dodgson died in 1898. Taking with him the full knowledge of what he had discovered in the caves beneath Little Wickham. His final diary entry, written the day before his death, contained only a mathematical formula that has never been successfully decoded, though researchers believe it may contain the locations of other children whose murders were never documented or investigated. The formula remains in the Oxford archives, classified alongside all other materials related to the Alice Whitmore case. The village of Little Wickham exists now only in official records that grow more difficult to access with each passing decade. The nature preserve that covers the area discourages visitors through bureaucratic obstacles and practical difficulties that ensure few people spend significant time exploring the ruins. Those who do report an overwhelming sense of sadness that seems to emanate from the earth itself, as if the ground remembers what was done beneath it and mourns for the children who never returned home. Alice Margaret Whitmore would have been 167 years old today had she been allowed to live beyond her 7th birthday. Instead, she remains forever 7, forever playing in gardens that exist now only in mathematics and literature, forever falling down rabbit holes that lead not to Wonderland but to stone chambers where her screams were silenced by those who should have protected her. Her story endures not as historical fact, but as coded testimony, preserved in the precise language of logic and love, by a man who understood that some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud, but too important to let die. The mathematics of memory prove more durable than the politics of concealment, and somewhere in the equations that describe impossible tea parties and talking cats, Alice Whitmore continues to testify against those who murdered her. Her voice echoes through every reading of her story, every recitation of the poems that bear her name, every moment when a child discovers wonder in the precise absurdity of Wonderland. The truth survives in the spaces between the words, in the calculations that balance logic against love, and in the persistence of justice that refuses to be buried, no matter how deep the grave or how powerful the gravediggers. Until the limestone caves are reopened and their secrets brought to light, until the classified documents are released and the truth acknowledged, until the descendants of murderers face the consequences of their inherited guilt, Alice Whitmore waits in the darkness beneath the English earth, 7 years old forever, patient as only the dead can be patient, certain as only mathematics can be certain that every equation must eventually balance and every debt must finally be paid.